my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Spike Gildea, professor and director of grad studies. Are you still director of grad studies?
No.
No, okay.
No, I
Your
stopped
website-
all of that when
Your
I
website
started.
needs to be updated. So,
Yeah.
he is a professor and former director of graduate studies in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Oregon. Spike's primary interests are descriptive and documentary fieldwork, historical functional typological syntax, and historical functional phonology. He has been working in South America with languages of the Cariban family since 1988, when he began field work in Panare in Venezuela. He has worked with speakers of 15 Carib languages. Outside of the Cariban family, he has worked briefly on Rama, Quiche, Lhasa Tibetan, and Kurto-Ep languages. His monograph on reconstructing grammar comparative Cariban morphosyntax was published by Oxford University Press in 1998. He has edited and co-edited many other books, including most recently Reconstructing Syntax from 2020, Nonverbal Predication in Amazonian Languages, Typological Studies in Language, and that's from 2018, and Diachronic Construction Grammar from 2015, as well as numerous articles and book chapters. Spike earned a BA in English Literature, yay, and an MA and PhD in Linguistics. All of those degrees are from the U of O, so Spike is a triple duck. Prior to returning to the U of O in 2000, he was an associate professor of linguistics at Rice University. As a 2022-23 Oregon Humanities Center Faculty Research Fellow, Spike Gildea has been working on a project titled, I'll just give you the title that's there, Sound Effects and Storytelling, Ideophones in Werikyana and Other Cariban Languages. Please join me in welcoming Spike Gildea.
Well, thank you. It's fun to be here and fun to have a chance to talk about this. So I just want to start with the thank you. That I've been doing so many other things for so long, I'd forgotten what it could feel like to just sit and focus on a topic in research. And this was a particularly nice one because it's something I'd never done before. I didn't even know what an idiophone was. Well, I mean, I sort of knew because I had worked with a bunch of them and working with various languages, but I just said, oh, that's an idiophone. I don't have to worry about that. And then I went back to this text and it's like, okay, I have to worry about them. And that's what this talk is about. So I said I was going to do three things on my application. I was going to do a serious translation of this one story. And because it's full of ideophones, as a part of that, I was going to collect lists of ideophones from all the related languages and say, all right, how do they line up? Can I reconstruct these? Because I do historical linguistics. I want to reconstruct them. And, you know, the experts say you can't. And I said, watch me. We'll see how that went. And then I wanted to just sort of explain, why is it that I have to deal with ideophones in this language? Why can't I just sidestep them like I have been all the rest of my career? And that's what this talk is about, are those three issues. So this is complicated. You need some background. As I already started, talking beforehand with some folks who were here early. What do you mean, Werikyana? I never heard of that. Well, yeah, neither had I until 2017 when they decided that was the name of the language. What are these Cariban languages? What's the family? What's the backstory to the story? Like, why are you translating this story? How do you do a good job when the grammar is so different? How do you translate? Well, we'll get to that. And yeah, what are these idiophone things? And why are you talking about them? And in order to do any of that, I think I have to start with the people. So first, the storyteller, this man, Churuata, also known by his Portuguese name, Cecilio Cachuiana. Yeah, he was introduced to me in 1994 as the last shaman of the Cachuiana people. One of the guys I was working with collecting comparative stuff came in and said, hey, my uncle's the last shaman. You want to record some stuff? And I'm like, yeah. So they came in for a couple of days. I got 8 hours of just them talking to each other. When you hear the recordings, you'll hear this rich, resonant, like I can kick your ass voice. That's Churuata. And you'll hear this guy who sounds like a little kid. That's his nephew, who was 40 years old at the time, but was thrilled to be in this position. Anyway, he died in 95 before I was going to go back and record a whole bunch more. I was just going in the summers and I didn't get to. But over the course of 3 summers, mixed in with my other work, I worked to transcribe and understand this one 27-minute story. It took 3 summers. That tells you something about the complexity of starting on a new language. Here's what I was hearing. I've been listening to this a lot lately. I've been hearing this voice in my dreams. Thank you again to the Humanities Center for this. So all these tribes, which you probably also never heard of, Cachuyana, Kahyana, Chikyana, Yoskuriana, they all speak the Werikyana language. It used to be called Cachuyana. The other tribes said, hey, what about us? We speak it too. And everyone agreed at a workshop on education that they were going to start calling it Werikyana. I'm still learning. So my quick history, there's first you got to know what the Cariban language family is, then you can talk about the Werikyana. So this is a map of South America. You can see here all these little 2-letter codes. Those represent different Cariban languages. The little blue diamond there is Werikyana, which was originally listed as Cachuyana or Cachuyana. Blowing that up a bit, I was saying I've worked with a lot of these languages. I started in the 80s in Venezuela with Panare and Yucpa, did 7 languages during my 4 years in Brazil, did another 5 languages during a 6-year project that got extended a couple of years in Guyana. The last few years I've been working with a colleague who I can't go to Venezuela now, but she's been working in Venezuela with the Yawarana language. And my dream is to spend the next 10 years, which will take me well into retirement, working with Werikyana, now spoken in that region with the pink parallelogram. So you need to know something about relationships. There's 23 languages. Hard to get a good classification of the languages for lots of reasons. What I'll point out is there's a Venezuelan branch. That's the only branch of any size. Then there are 3 groups, Taranoan, Pecodian, and Paracotoan, which is of particular interest to me because the Werikyana language belongs to it. So Werikyana, Hishkariana, and Waiwai are very closely related. The others, not so much. So if you look at that geographically, you see Werikyana traditional territory in the parallelogram. Where they were at the time I worked with them is in the little diamond. You see the related languages, Hishkariana and Waiwai. And then you see the related but more distantly languages spoken off to the east and to the north. So that's kind of situating you. Now, before 68, those spaces look kind of close looking at this, but if you actually look at it from like Google Earth, same region, they're a long ways apart. And there's a lot of obstacles to communication between them. So communication between tribes was a major deal when it happened. So the Werikyana speaking tribes were in that region, Waiwai and Ishkariana. Then you have the Akurio, Tirio, Wayana, and Apalai, quite a ways away. So you can see why those 3 languages are more similar to each other. And there wasn't historically a lot of contact. First, we know about the Werikyana. An anthropologist in the early 20th century made contact, took some photos in 1940. Here are some of the people on the Kachuru River. So they were the Kachuyana that he met. And these are some of the peoples that, as he described them. Now, the Kachuru River was blocked from exploitation by the Europeans and by later Brazilian society by a whole bunch of rapids and this major waterfall. There's a picture coming up on it. There's a picture from above. There's a picture from the 1940s. It's still big and bad. We had to portage around it. It took about 2 hours to walk around it. A pretty good obstacle that basically kept them protected so that they are not in the situation of all the tribes in Brazil that are now reachable by highway. You build a road, it's a new world. That new world has not yet arrived in this region, which is why I have the incredible good fortune that I have of the people to work with. That said, in the first half of the 1900s, with those initial contacts, the usual problems started with disease. They have no resistance to diseases that wiped out stretches of Europe and Africa and Asia over centuries. And so a whole bunch of people disappeared quickly. They blamed it on shamanic warfare, but the symptoms of shamanic warfare look a lot like influenza, smallpox, you know. So all the groups disappeared or merged with the Cachuyana, at least according to this anthropologist. And in the late 60s, there were only 50 left. 2 families went west to join the Werikyana. However, that was not reported in the literature. I only learned that about 5 years ago. The other 40 people who were reported to be the last 40 went downriver to this frontier town Óbidos, where there was a Brazilian Air Force base. Brazilian Air Force general said, yeah, we'll fly you up to visit. You know, you can go with the TDO. They're your parentes, your relatives in some sense, like kind of like, you know, Volya and I are relatives, right? You know, English and Russian are, you know, they're different branches of Indo-European. What's the problem? You know? So anyway, the assumption was that the Cachuyana would assimilate in no time once they got there, because 40 of them, 900 TDO, and everyone needed to intermarry because it was one family. They couldn't marry each other and raise kids, right? That was not thinkable. So geographically situating this, there you are. Notice the ecosystem. Do you see something different about the jungle there? It's not a jungle, right? You're up at these headwaters of the rivers. You're in mountainous area, huge savanna, different ecosystem, different way of interacting with the world. And then when you get closer, geez, there's this paved airstrip. There's military housing. There's military folks around guarding the border with Suriname. Check out the village. Here's a traditional village for you, all laid out on a grid with concrete buildings. It's a really different world, right? So they're in a completely different thing. 94, this is when I first met them. I was doing this comparative project. I just wanted to know how many Cariban languages were actually spoken. There's this issue of there were 20 names in the literature. So how many peoples might that be? You know, as you get a different name from each explorer coming from each direction, you might just be one group with 20 names. So that was my job. I went to Misao and TDO as a part of my trips there because, well, I had a student working on TDO and I wanted to keep an eye on him while he was getting started. And also because a whole bunch of people, it was sort of a crossroads for people from Suriname, French Guiana, Northern Brazil, thought, let's go check it out. And I was able to work with Waiwai, Akurio, Waiana, Apalai, and Werikyana. So it turned out to pay off. So just to give you a sense again of geographic isolation, why is it that these folks were still living fairly traditional lives and speaking their language? Well, here's how you get there. 3 days by boat from Belém to Santarém. That was my research crew, all 3 of whom now have doctorates. One of whom is a professor of biology at Oregon State now. We got onto a bush plane and flew north. There's us loading the bush plane. Notice the guitar, that was critical to intercultural relations and also my sanity. And then we started flying. This is leaving the city. Notice the Amazon is this huge coffee and cream colored river. You see the blue water at the top of that picture? That would be the Tapajós River coming in from the south. It's a blue water river. They run side by side for a while, and I love that picture, so I put it in every talk that involves airplanes. So this is what you saw, just hours of unbroken jungle. You have to get down pretty low to even see the rivers because they just disappear from a height. And you can get down and you can see villages. This is what a village looks like in the more traditional setting. You can't just land a plane there, though. So when you get to Misao and TDOs, yeah, it's not a typical village scene. The Werikyana speaking peoples were somewhat still off kilter. And this was 25 years after they had come to live there. So anyway, I was there to do my comparative work. I started in, but between sessions with other speakers, I said, how much can I learn about Werikyana? Because they're going to assimilate. They're going to disappear. This is my chance. Work with those elders. And so I was after comparative word lists. This is João do Vale, who is the nephew of Churuata. Any other world, he would be a leading intellectual. He is absolutely brilliant. So I appreciated the chance to work with him. People would sometimes bring their families to work. And then at night, because I was in a place with hydroelectric power, and I was actually able to work at night and plug in my laptop. It was like, I'd never had a jungle experience quite like this. Well, wasn't a jungle, right? And notice the walls around me. I had screens on the windows. I could sit without. I'm sorry. So back to the story. Churuata came. His nephew brought him in. They spoke 8 hours. He told stories. He talked about the older ways of living, talked about ceremonies, and he talked about how different their homeland is. He was basically agitating already. And his nephew was one of the people that led the return to their current region. They've all, or over half of them, have gone back now. And that's where I work with them now. So once again, there's the man, Churuata. So I'm working with the recordings, and in those 3 summers, I transcribed less than 30 minutes, but it wasn't just transcribing. You got to transcribe exactly as the guy says it, and people always want to editorialize. So you have to go listen again. Is that really what he said? And then you get another person, and then after a while, you think you've got a pretty good approximation, but working off cassette tapes takes a while. Then you got to translate it into Portuguese. So you work with 2 or 3 people for each sentence to get a sense of what each of them might translate it as. And then you try to figure out the grammar. I do. I mean, that's breathing in and out for me. That's what, I can't believe they pay me to work on puzzles like this. So João Duvali again, he got a pair of glasses on the 2nd year that we were working. And this is Honorio, who was the eldest of the family that went to Missão Tidios. He passed early in COVID. And there's me again late at night going, how do I do this? Let me listen to it again and type. So 30 years later, 29 years later, I'm coming back to this story. Last August, I printed out all those transcriptions and translations, and I took the printouts to the 7th workshop on education in the Werikyana language, and a whole bunch of young kids and a couple of elders and some really young kids. Well, these are the bilingual school teachers. They were ankle biters when I was there in the 90s. Now they're the village leaders. They're the authorities. And then the old people like me are the ones who sit there and pass out wisdom. So the kids were there fixing my transcriptions. Nobody argued with any of the translations, which convinces me they didn't understand it as well as they thought they did. Then, I've since been working more with 3 more people. This is Juvencino Pesirima. I work with him by Zoom, as you can see from the Zoom thing. And he was the youngest of the family that moved to Missão Tidios, and he can understand it all. And he launches into stuff. I've started recording our sessions. I don't know when I'll get the spare time to read or to listen to him again or do something with him, but he just says so much. Lucas Castellano, who's now the vice president of the local indigenous association and someone who's trying to bring back and develop a writing system. And he's really good at that part of it. He does analysis and he does the writing. And Neji Castellana, who is the granddaughter of Churuata and the only woman with an advanced degree. She has a bachelor's degree in education, and then said, no, I want to go back out and live in the village. Fortunately, right before COVID. And so, her mother in the background there is Churuata's only offspring, his daughter. And so I had a chance to meet her. That's me waving at her going, oh my God, fanboy, you're the daughter of that guy. So here's the story. Some ignorant guy, because everyone was ignorant in the old days, right? Nobody had culture. He caught a fish and she turned into a beautiful woman. And lo and behold, she wanted to marry him. And he was like, yeah. And then she starts civilizing him. And she takes him beneath the water to this magical homeland where she came from. And they learn about all these things down there. He learns about agriculture and how to paint your body right and beadwork and clothes. And turns out there was no sunrise or sunset before either. And he learned about that. And then they decide they're going to bring all the benefits of civilization to his people. And that's 27 minutes. So this is a very condensed version. And so I started thinking about the translation. When you read about translation theory, people are always saying there's this debate between folks that say it can't be done and folks that say, sure, it can. You just have to be sufficiently diligent, persistent, perceptive, linguistically superior. Okay, fail, but okay, I can be persistent. Anyway, these are the kinds of things that I was reading and getting depressed about translation, in part because the folks that say it can't be done have a point, as far as I can tell. In all the languages that I speak, when I try to say, what did he just say? It's like, well, I can give you words that will get you in the neighborhood, but it means something different to him than those words are going to mean to you. And that's the issue of sort of the purpose or the cultural translation. And as I was reading about that, I finally said, I got to quit reading about theory of translation and just do it. Because it's extremely difficult to say it in such a way as to capture the flavor of the way it was said. And that's especially true for storytelling. And even though everyone agrees equivalence isn't strictly possible, how close can you get for approximation? So one of the issues we know about from linguistic studies in general, as the degree of overlap in experience increases, communication works better. As the degree of overlap in cultural experiences decreases, communication is increasingly fraught. You think you know what they mean by their words, but it turns out the experience that you're drawing on to give meaning to the words are very different from the experiences that the speaker was drawing on to put the meaning in the words, as it were. And so obviously, that's a factor in this text. I'll say, as Annalisa said in her talk and her work in progress talk last week, one of the joys of translation is it makes you take a deep dive. It is incredible how different things look after you've been on the inside of them for a few weeks. And that I really appreciate, including I've been hearing Chiruata's voice all around me for a month now. But here was my big issue. The sound effect words really threw me off. So first off, I thought, all right, he's telling a story and he's just making up all these sounds. And as he's making them up, it's nice, but I don't have to worry about those. And then I discovered, well, turns out sound effect words wasn't all of it. So Kate Kelp-Stebbins did this nice talk about from comic studies about graphic novels, and they have sound effects all written in. And translators, some of them don't even bother to translate them. And I said, I can do that. And then it turns out, well, damn, these sound effect words are conventionalized lexical items. That means everybody knows them. When you say them, that means something. It's not just some guy making up noises. And that meant I actually had to deal with the word class of ideophones because these are things that it's a cultural resource available to all speakers of the language that was simply unavailable to me, and I didn't even know to look for it, right? Remember, this was 94 when I started on this, and I put it away for almost 30 years because, well, you can imagine. So the question, what is an idiophone? Well, it's a part of speech, and in general, parts of speech do particular jobs, nouns, person, place, or thing, verbs, action, event, or state, nouns and verbs together in clauses, who does what to whom, right? So you've got your parts of speech, you got the algebra of grammar. But most native oral traditions, actually outside of the European, even in Indic, there are lots of ideophones. It's the European traditions where writing has replaced storytelling, it seems like, that have very few ideophones. So they're kind of like color commentary. They depict rather than denote. So denoting is, it basically says, I'm going to give you a bunch of words. Now you build the image in your head that matches those words. Depicting, I'm going to tell you what it looked like, and you're going to just see it. Doesn't always work that way, especially if you don't speak the language, but it does definitely make things more lively. So technical definitions include important statements like they have a special dramaturgic function, which is color commentary. They vividly depict sensory experience, right on. I asked Neji, so what do these words do? I gave her a Portuguese language version of the talk I gave to the FLIS students a month ago. And she was like, oh, that's why you've been worried about this. No, he's just illustrating what's happening. It just illustrates the actions in the story. That's all that is. And I'm like, cool. Depict, illustrate, same difference. So when you start looking at ideophones as a technical term in an area of study, it's pretty recent. So expressives, Mimetics, descriptive, sound words, people have been talking about them, but they didn't actually become a thing until the last century, towards the end of the last century. So in 1935, a Bantuist said, you know, they're a word class in Bantu, and then everyone ignored him for a long time. And then in 2001, a whole bunch of people said, no, we need a workshop on this. These are all over the world. Let's call them all by the same name. And so they had a volume on ideophones. I liked a couple of these titles, which, you know, the idiophone as a linguistic rebel. Are ideophones really as weird and extra systematic as linguists make them out to be? Short answer, yes. There was another one entitled, are ideophones translatable? To which their answer was yes, but then when you looked at the examples, no. So again, I thought, okay, I got to stop looking at the literature. It's making me depressed. But I did at least go so far as to say, are these really ideophones? Well, how do you know one when you see one? They're words. They are a lexical class. They are marked. That is, as a lexical class, there is particular grammar that tells you they're different from all the other lexical classes. They depict rather than denoting. So there's something about this vividness to them, and speakers see that and tell you that. Their meanings are limited. They are the domain of sensory imagery. So it's about feelings, things you hear, things you see, things you experience. They're not just anything. You don't give a dissertation in ideophones. You tell a story about stuff that's really happening in ideophones. And they are an open lexical class. If they're really a part of the grammar, that means you can always add new ones, and there's in principle no limit to how big the class could be. The largest class described so far is Korean with 3,000. I'm guessing that's because there are a lot of Korean authors who went to the work of doing it. If there were a lot of Werikyana authors, I'd have a lot more of these than I do. So far, there aren't any. This should change. So it's key to say, I know people hear about ideophones and they think onomatopoeia because that's what we have in English. It's easy to remember. These are iconic words. They sound like something that they're describing. So woof woof is supposed to sound like a dog. Tick tock is supposed to sound like a clock. Twang is supposed to be the sound of dropping something, maybe metallic, right? So you've got these sounds and they depict something. They are like ideophones, but they're a subset of ideophones that are iconic. A lot of ideophones are not iconic. So they're ideophones for things that don't have any sounds. And I tried to find one in English. All I got was one from my cartoon watching days as a little kid. Someone sitting there thinking hard, and then a light bulb appears above their head and you hear ping. That's the sound of having an idea, right? So having an idea doesn't really have a sound, except the cartoons made it so that now you can say ping and people think, oh, he had an idea. If you're old like me and watch those cartoons. Yeah. So Dingamunse talks about this. Why do people always get confused between onomatopoeia and ideophones? It's because ideophones feel like they're iconic, even when they're not. Ping is not iconic of having an idea. It's iconic of having a light bulb go over your head in a cartoon where you hear the sound ping, which means you had an idea. So basically, without having benefit of these cartoons, ideophones are what happen in these languages where there are lots and lots of these sounds for things that happen that don't make noise without the benefit of cartoons as an intermediary. And they just feel iconic somehow, even though they're not. And his claim is that's because they vividly depict something happening. You hear the sound and you just see it, even though it's not the sound of the thing happening. So, for instance, you can have kinds of movement, you can have common actions. These are all ideophones from this one story. Walk, sit, swim, writhe, float, enter, exit, bail a canoe, hit, drag, burn, be surprised, be afraid, wonder, or to express them, to cry, shout, or laugh. Weather, different kinds of rain, wind, thunder, lightning, passage of time. There's a sound for the sunrise and a sound for the sunset. There's a sound for a few hours passing. There's a sound for days passing. There's a sound for weeks passing. And those are all used. Phases, there's a sound for starting to do something and a sound for stopping and a sound for stopping because you're done, because you actually finished it, right? There's also interpersonal communications. Maybe we should call these interjections. And there's animal noises, lots of them. The names for over half the birds are the sounds they make, like chickadee in English, right? Chickadee. So anyway, there are people who write their entire articles just sorting through the categories of meaning. in Ideophones. I started to go down that rabbit hole and then said, wait, now that wasn't part of what I said I was going to do. So you need to hear some of these. What's the sound of finishing something? Four different things got finished. I stole the tarat from each place. The sound of finishing something can be very quiet, almost inaudible, right? Just in passing, he finished, right? What's the sound of a guy getting clothes tied on him for the very first time? They tied a whole bunch of noisemakers on him as he was learning how to decorate himself properly. The sound of planting for the first time when you never had agriculture before. Bloop, bloop, they were done. Bloop, bloop, ta-da. The sound of grabbing something. A couple different grabs happened here. To, to. You can guess what he pulled out. Okay. The sound of someone showing up. Arrival and departure. Entering. So as you came in the door, a snake that's holding all of these gifts for the people, and it's just in pain because there's such a heavy load. Scaring the hell out of the people, of course. But hey, they had to go get their stuff somehow. Fish swimming by while you're underwater and you can breathe because it's magical. Fish can also approach you and check you out. So, now you hear that, he's making this shit up. You know he's just making it up. No. Everyone heard those and said, that's this. Chipe, chipe, chipe. That's the sound of a piranha swimming. The other two, I don't know what the fish was, but everyone agreed when they heard the chipe. Oh, it's a piranha swimming. It's like, what do? Stick your head underwater where there's piranhas and listen? I mean, come on. So anyway, point being, they're not just onomatopoeia. So the grammar, what makes them a marked word class? They don't take prefixes or suffixes. They don't show up in regular words. They get reduplicated a whole bunch of the time. And they get pronounced with strange intonation. That's what I'm going to focus on here. And these other things are all things, this could go on for 3 hours or more, and I would have fun. But I want you to hear some of this. You've already heard some of it. You heard that, he uses his voice as he's saying these things. So here's some more examples of how you know that it's not just the letters on the page, but it's actually how you say them. So I just translated the other stuff, but you hear that ha-ha every time? I can't even do it. He can get his voice higher than I can. So now, when I first had this written down, I just had written down ho moto. I didn't even know there was an idiophone there, and then I'm listening later, going, "Wait a minute." That sounds, and sure enough, you can say ho ho or ha ha, but it's that tone of voice that tells you I'm mocking. I'm doing mocking laughter here, and sure enough, it worked. How about that one? When you're surprised, what do you say? I actually didn't realize this. My wife was harassing me the other day because I'm so excited by hood. And she said, when I first met you, I thought you were weird because every time you were surprised, you said, yeah. And I realized I learned that in Nepal because that was their idiophone for something surprising that I'm just expressing. Not a bad surprise, well, I mean, it's not a bad surprise to find a beautiful woman in your canoe where there was just a dying fish before, right?
So that was just 3 ideophones as a sentence, basically. They went in to this magic portal. Hood, he was surprised, and pua, they exited on the top of the water. So, yeah. I think it's safe to say that a rising intonation contour is characteristic of the sound of surprise. And I don't know how to write that, and I sure as hell don't know how to translate it. All right? So, there are other sounds of surprise, but that's how that's the disgusted surprise. Just here's what, well, damn, I forgot where I was in the story. So you just hear, so different sounds of surprise come with different voice qualities, different melodic patterns. How about fear? Would you do fear like this? Yeah. So I'm about to sit on a giant anaconda. I'm sitting on a caiman right now. Yaka, you're not gonna bite me, right? Yaka, I'm on a giant anaconda. Yaka, the sun is setting. I'm about to die. So just yaka. It's not even like, where's the excitement? This is a stoic response to hardship. Now, there are a couple that you can believe in. He almost did die that time. He was meeting his father-in-law for the first time. It was a giant anaconda. Yeah, so let's get technical for a minute. That's why I got so into this. It was like, it's everywhere. It's throughout. How do I deal with this? So, well, I know what I can do. I can go look at how other Cariban languages do it. And part of my job was to get lists of ideophones. So I gathered these resources, which I'm not going to talk about now. Turned out, I will highlight one thing. There was a master's thesis done on ideophones in YY that I learned about literally last week. So that was a lot of fun. I suddenly worked a lot of new material into my talk. But pointing out here that the yellow line above that represents the closely related languages, below that not, but the green box represents languages that have been in contact in the last 100 years at least. So as you look at how many ideophones did we find for each one, between 100 and 200, except for these 2 at the bottom. Very few for them. That probably means something. I'm not sure. Maybe it means we talked to the wrong storytellers, but it still is interesting. And now we can ask that historical question. Can we reconstruct ideophones? So the 2 principles for reconstruction is you have cognates, which are words that descend from a common origin. They have form and meaning that are too similar to be a coincidence. And these cognates contain sound changes. So you identify this proto-sound turned into this range of sounds in the daughter languages. And those are called correspondences. So you go looking for those. So Latin to English, pater, father. The P corresponds to F. The T corresponds to th. And this is a really convenient example, but there are hundreds of these that give you the Germanic language family where p became f and t became th, etc. You can do this in Cariban. The cognates are easy for this bunch of languages I was looking at. Found the word for breast. It's practically the same word all the way across. The word for ear has some nice correspondences, though. Pana is hana is fana. So the pa, fa, ha historical change has given rise to an interesting correspondence. This is the kind of stuff you look for to say, is that cognate? Well, I don't know. If it's got a P in this language, it better have an H in that one. So that's kind of how you know you got cognates. I got another page of these. They're easy to find. Nouns, verbs, adverbs. No problem. There are no adjectives, so that's easy too. But when I started doing ideophones, it's like, okay, it's not working out so well, right? Well, there's sort of a kuru in all of these, but kuru, I don't know. Well, there's sort of a kuru, but sometimes it's a kuruk, and sometimes it's a kurun, and sometimes it's a kuro. It's kind of, there's something there. And there's a ku at the start of all the swallows, And coulda is also there in grab, kind of like tie on. And oh, look, in dawn there's sa, san, and sa for 3 of them. And in arrive there's a pore and 2 of them. And you start going, you know what? This isn't working out so well. These are my best examples. After I went through hundreds of Ideophones, I have 6 not very good examples. Now, there's one more. It's a not very good example, and the rest are all like think, surprise, lightning, and finish, where there's nothing. Nothing. And so, short version of the conclusion, yeah, I was wrong, they were right. You can't reconstruct the Ideophones, at least in Cariban. I haven't given up, but I'd have to do a lot more work to have a chance, and maybe it would be a lot more work that wouldn't work out. Yeah, well, there's worse fates. You could not have work. Anyway, there's also talk about contact being the way these things spread. That's something I would love to explore in future work. So another comparative question came up, though, because I'm looking at all these Ideophones, and I'm saying, why didn't they bug me in the languages before? Well, one reason they didn't bug me is because the different languages use them differently, and the languages that I worked on were on the low end of Ideophone usage. So first, when you just looked at our collections of text, how many Ideophones did I see get used, deployed in the text? Not how many do they have, but how dense are they in a text? And so, Werikyana and YY, 1,000 to 2,000 to 2,500. TDO and Apalai, 1,300. Apalai up to 3,000. So there's a lot. They're using them. But then I had to say, well, actually, that could be a function of how many words you have. Because look, 239 Ideophones in Werikyana, I had a total of 27 minutes of text. These others, we had hours of text. So maybe it's not a fair comparison. So let's say how many words are in all the text, and then we'll get a comparison. Just to get a sense, how often do they really use these things? Turns out Werikyana, YY, and Werikyana, 12.5%, you might say, of the words in their text are Ideophones. Like they're using sound effect words more often than 1 in 10 words. And it's not just Werikyana, so it's not just this one weird language I work with. That was interesting to discover. You look at these others, there's a group that have something like somewhere between, say, 2 and 5%, less than half, but still they're appreciable. Guess which languages I worked with? Wayana and Akawayo, that I was doing this original work with. And so I said, okay, that makes sense. And then Cariban, another language I worked with, 1%, like 1 word in 100 is an Ideophone. Right? That's not a lot of functional load. You're not doing a lot with Ideophones if you don't use them if they're that rare. And then there's Apalai, it's like 2,900 Ideophones in one collection of text. I don't have a count of words. I guess I could sit there with a pencil, but I'd like to figure out how to make it computer countable so that I wouldn't have to do it. So I can't say what the percentage is there. So I went for another thing, because I did have these broken down in clauses in a bunch of these, and that allows me to look at the Apalai. So in Werikyana and Werikyana, we have, about, there is 0.4, roughly 0.4 Ideophones per clause, which means every 2.5 clauses, you have an Ideophone. And in these other ones, it's like every 5 clauses you have an Ideophone. And then in Cariban, every 100 clauses you have an Ideophone. But in Apalai, look at that, you have more than 1 Ideophone per clause. I really need to get access to the recordings that one is based on, because I gotta know. Yeah. How do they have 2.5 times as much as Werikyana? That freaked me out. And we'll see. Anyway, first conclusion, there's 4 different levels of Ideophone density. The one I'm interested in is the one with Werikyana, of course, which has high Ideophone density. And I'd like to explain it with comparison to the low and medium Ideophone density languages I'd worked with before. Why is it? And to do that, you really need to look at how they get used. And so here's a part of the story where the guy's first learning about the sunset. He had never seen a sunset before. What's going on? That's the sound of the sun setting, by the way. That's him crying. She's telling him, shush up. Wait a while. Still not asleep. He was still crying. A few hours passed. Dawn.
Habla español y viene. Pura español. Isso se rasca. Não. Olha aí, que me nai ho mo da tenu ko nai ora kana mati ko en eso es todo
Now, if you look at that, all those bolded ones were ideophones. So you can see they were just shot throughout there. So every emotional reaction in that stretch was an idiophone. It never. I did say, well, he was crying, but the sound of fear, the sound of, oh, thank God, right? The bird song was an idiophone. Time passing. He didn't just say, and after a while, it just, kotop, kotop, kotop. Time passes, right? But then also there are patches where the idiophones carry it forward. They were saying pusak, pusak, meant they were jumping from the water. On land, sorep his arrow. He pulled out his arrow, but it doesn't say he pulled out his arrow, it just says sorep. You have to know what that's going to mean. Oh. Sorry. And then, poros. He shoots and hits the rau. Again, this is the action carried forward. There is no denotation. There's only depiction. There's an example of a shot from the 1940s of a guy fishing with a bow and arrow. There's an example of a pacu fish being caught. Wasn't arrowed in this case, but caught on a hook. So, yeah, the big deal here is there's no denotation. Events are denoted by verbs. They got prefixes that tell you who does what to whom. They got suffixes telling you when and how it's done. Idiophones, they got nothing. They're just, there's the sound. And that means your listeners have a different job. They're not getting to follow the algebra of the grammar to know everything that they need to know. They have to fill in a lot of detail. They got to kind of guess who the subject was and guess who the object was of an event of shooting. It's not hard. Guy with the bow is the one doing the shooting. The fish is the one getting hit. But you still have to do that work. It's not explicit in the grammar. So my current explanation is, in the languages I worked on before, idiophones really were just color commentary. Like these. So, disappear, she would disappear. Depart, she would go again. Arrive, she would come again. He beat it. Wham! Basically, all of these are repetitions. You got a sentence that denotes, and then a sound effect, your idiophone that just kind of depicts. So you get a double whammy. That's what I was expecting. And that's why I was looking at Werikyana going, what the hell's going on here? And it's because he just tells the story. So he doesn't describe things, he just depicts directly, and that stands in for what we in the European tradition would expect as a denotation. So if you listen, these are just words, right? He's describing. Now, they were jumping. He saw it. He dragged his canoe. So, you see what's happening, right? And now, how do we get those 10 idiophones into a translation? The first option I thought of was, I'm just going to double translate every line. When it gets to that, I'm just going to put them, we're going to be having a story and suddenly there's going to be 2 lines with what he actually said, followed by what that means. So that you have to work through what they're doing to each other with this. Several people commented on how much they didn't like seeing it that way. It's not good for reading. So I said, okay, fine, we'll go with the second option. We'll treat it as if it were the way the other Cariban languages do it. They were jumping from the water. Pusak, pusak. He saw it. He dragged his canoe onto the shore. And on land, sorep, he pulled out an arrow. Koro koro, he walked a bit. And topo, he arrived at the river's edge and released the arrow. And boros, hit a rau fish. Bokyeti, it floated to the surface, blah, blah, blah. Okay? So it works if you read it out loud. On the page, you got to do something to make those words a different color or make them jump out or something. And then my favorite was the one that I got in doing an interview with October, who said, "What, you could do a graphic novel." And he did. And like, damn. I showed this to the 3 people on the internet Wednesday morning, and they're all like, "Can you get him to do some more? Can he like do the rest of the story?" And I'm like, I think he's got other things to do, but we can talk about it. But more to the point, can we take a bunch of drawing materials down there and get someone to just say, "Here, go for it. Get your students to illustrate these stories. Get them to understand the story from the inside the way I had to," because they don't speak the language anymore. So, anyway, in conclusion, I started off with the question, is all this idiophone usage, is this like historical change? Like just one group of the languages just started doing it more? I've come to the conclusion that is partly the truth. Is it an effect of genre? Maybe this particular kind of story gets more of them than other stories. That one I don't think so, because I overheard people telling stories to each other about hunting trips, and they had a lot of them, right? But then, is this like a master storyteller laying it on thick? I think yes, but I can't prove that. But what makes me think that in part is that the apalai difference. There's 2 sets of texts. One of those was a master storyteller laying it on so thick there was more than one idiophone per sentence. You know, throughout an entire set of hundreds, over 2,000 clauses, over 2,000 sentences. So that's got to be individual variation there. Because the other apalai corpus was just like Werikyana, like the languages that I knew that were normal. The third possibility, well, no. How do you answer this? You got to get in there and do a documentation project. So you got to get a lot of recordings of a lot of storytellers and a lot of genres and do the hard work of transcribing them and seeing what's there. So last August, I had a workshop on the Werikyana language. All these folks agreed that they wanted to do a documentation project. So the leaders of the speech community brainstormed about it. This is the Juvencino up there explaining to them kind of what we had all brainstormed together, but putting it into the other 2 languages of the people there. And here they are already starting in. They're starting to take recordings. They got tripods for cell phones, remote microphones to get high quality sound. They're ready. We already started breaking down words into the explicit morphemes. And this winter I submitted a proposal to NSF. I hope they do it so we can start work when my sabbatical starts in January. But in the meantime, I still get to work with these fine folks every weekend, and that is sweet. So my final thoughts, it's a real blast to work with languages whose grammar you know nothing about, because you get surprised by things like ideophones. It's also a little thing like Ideophones. Oh, yeah, I could do that in 10 weeks. Well, shit. Yeah, I realize there are people that have made careers out of this, and I'm not going to be one of them. Because what really matters now is I'm finally coming back to work with these people after 30 years. I'm making a commitment. We're going to do a full project with all of them. This is what they want to help keep their languages vital. They want a full corpus of recordings that they can download on their cell phones in the villages, because they have internet in the villages now. They want a grammar, they want a dictionary, and that's where I'm going to be going for the next 10 years. But I'm still intensely grateful that I had a chance to take this 10 weeks, because wow, I learned a lot. Done it shorter, but
Questions
I
for
think that
Spike?
became expansive. Sorry, I had this timed 10 minutes shorter, but I think I became expansive.
What you're describing obviously is an oral culture, a serious oral culture.
Yes.
And on the one hand, they have the advantages of being very expressive, very emotive, but as your work at workshops show, these people want to preserve something, and to preserve something, they are traversing the sometimes tortuous road from an oral culture to a literal culture.
Mm-hmm.
And as I say, when you make that transition, there are some things you lose, but
Yes.
there are some things you gain, which is, I guess, preservation of a
Mhm.
community, which is able to pass on, shall we say.
Well, that's already happening. The trick here is that the usual modes of cultural transmission have been broken. You know, the missionary activity led to a direct, everybody stopped working with the shamans because, you know, they represented the wrong side in this particular spiritual, cultural conflict. And at that point, many of the stories, why the shamans not only contained the knowledge of the pharmacopoeia from the jungle, but they also had most of the traditional knowledge. And these stories are in fact in competition with other creation stories that were introduced by the missionaries. And so it is the case that we need these recordings now because then other kids can listen to them and learn them again via a modified version of traditional transmission. It's a new world, but it used to be the only way to retain someone's words was to write them. And that's why this sense of the permanence and stability of writing is so powerful. But now we do have other means. And if we can pair the writing always with something auditory or oral, I think we'll have a lot more powerful combination. But it is real that they want the writing as well. I would like to think of it not as having to choose between them, but as both and. I'm really hoping we can make it additive rather than replacive. And it is the case that, of course, the new spiritual traditions are replacive. And so I'm hoping that our work can be a secular alternative.
Would that preserve another shaman or create another shaman?
That's not my call. But let's say if another one comes, I'll work with them.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a really hard. It's dangerous in that people ask me, well, what do you want to do? And I keep saying, well, that's not the right question. It's what can I do to help them do what they want to do? And that's even not quite the right framing because them is never, have you ever met a community that agreed on everything or on anything? Right. So there are certainly different groups that have really different takes. And obviously I'm working with the people that want to work with me. And I do wonder, what can I offer to the folks that think maybe that's not the right thing? And so that's also a part of what I have to think about. It's really complicated. There are a lot of people who have welcomed the missionary activities. They have assimilated into some version of that new spiritual culture. And I don't want to tell them, well, that was an awful mistake, but I also don't want to abandon those who have not adopted that tradition and who do want to preserve these things. I think there should be modern value to this work, not just archival value. And at the very least, you got to have something to read. Paulo Freire said it, right? If you're going to be literate, you got to have something to read. Here you go. We got something for you to read. And that will be in addition to the works that are being produced right now by the Summer Institute of Linguistics folks. They're translating Bible stories and offering it to the schools as literacy materials. I'm saying, well, that's fine. Here's something else you can also read. And if y'all want to get the tools to make up all your own stuff, I'm here to work with you for the next 10 years. And now that we can do it by internet, maybe more. So it is, sorry, you opened a lot of doors with that comment on sort of cultural trends. I forgot the word. Yeah, transition. There's a lot there.
Can you explain your process of, you have a list of, 10, 15 languages.
Yeah.
I mean, and you say you work with these languages. You learn all of them, or how does that work?
I have not become a speaker. I got to be a partial speaker of Werikyana, and I'm starting now on Werikyana. With the others, it was all via translation. So the idea is usually you record stories and then you transcribe and then get translations. And so you can work with monolingual folks on the transcription part, but obviously translations, you need someone that speaks a contact language. It was funny when I started because my Spanish was abysmal and so was theirs. And so we were there talking at each other in abysmal Spanish, for my work in Venezuela. I remember I was saying, this is what this translate as a talk in a Spanish speaking country. And people looked at me like, that's not Spanish you just gave us. I don't know how to translate that. I said, well, here's what he meant. And they're like, well, how do you know? You don't speak Spanish so good either. And I said, well, that's how I know. We both speak Spanish badly. And so I just knew that was what that meant.
So So were there organizations who document these different languages, you know, when you say you get a translation of?
Oh, no, the documentation, we're the ones doing that. That it is academics that are doing documentation. And basically we train people, you get a doctorate in sort of descriptive linguistics, and it takes a number of years, and there's a whole workflow that you have to go through. But what I was doing with those different languages, I was doing comparative work. So I didn't try to do that with every language. I worked on texts with Panare, Akawayo, Wayana, and Werikyana only. The others, I just collected words and you know, short sentences, things that I knew I needed in order to describe how the words had descended from the parent language, from the reconstructed proto-language. So I just reconstructed things that I knew existed in half a dozen languages. All right, let me look for it in all the new languages I meet. So those were like in 2 weeks I could get what I needed, which I did, which sounds very exploitative, which it was. Trying to make up for that.
It's now 1 o'clock. If people have to leave, please feel free to do so. But if Spike is willing to continue taking questions, you're welcome.
Hey.
And thank him again.
Oh. Yeah. Sorry, I talked so long. I really encroached heavily on question time. I apologize. But yeah, I can stay if people do want to keep asking questions. You're welcome. Yeah. Yeah.
I can ask you later, but I do sort of wonder about, like, when you say they understand what these things mean, is that because they're familiar with the story, or they've heard this before? Are they thinking of the context in which it's used in the story? Or, I mean, are these things like used broadly by people? Then they talk about the honest.
Right. Well, it is clearly the case that I was just presenting these words to people out of context. Like I made lists of them in one of our workshops, and they started coming up with other ones out of context. So they're just out there, but they have fairly broad meanings. And so like the sound toro, it could be the sound of dropping someone into something on a boat. It could be the sound of dropping something on the ground. It could be the sound of putting something into a bag. And so when you just say toro out of context, you don't know which one it is. But in the story, and part of this is I think they know the story, so he doesn't have to say into a bag or into the canoe, but other times he actually says it, toro, toro, into the canoe, you know, toro, his bag. And so you know that the detail comes in context in the story, but the general concept, which can have a lot, and these are kind of broad things, they aren't as specific as a standard noun or a verb. So you definitely need the context to get the precise image. Now, I don't know how to do the study, but I would love to know what image comes up in people's minds when you just give them a word out of context. Like in the story, I know what image comes up because they talk about it, but just totally out of context. What do you see when I say kachuk kachuk kana? You know, and that should be the sound of bailing out a canoe, but are you in the front or the back of the canoe? Is the canoe leaking? Is it just a little bit? Did you like hit a wave? What, I wonder what the kind of prototype bailing sound image is. If it's you know, they did decent at understanding Spanish. If you'd like to come down sometime, we could talk about putting together such a study. Do we have portable eye tracking now? Like you just do it on a laptop, right?
Well, yes, I mean, it's possible.
Oh,
Well, yeah.
we should talk. Donnie, did you start?
So I think there's 50 left at some point, and then like about 8 of them moved somewhere else, and then you were working with like the remains of around 40.
Right.
So any efforts to contact or trace any of the 8th Ujue, and what would their kind of, how do you think that data might affect the Ideophones? If that they've changed over time, if there's been any storytelling in remains.
These are those people. These workshops are what's been blowing my mind. The last, I started doing them in 2014 when they were working on a writing system, and we've gotten into grammar and now documentation. The last 2 workshops, there were members from these tribes that came, and turns out they still,
one of the big things that has been messing with us and trying to come up with a good writing system is the people, the elders who grew up speaking Werikyana as their first language in their traditional territory, have a particular way of talking that is really distinctive. I can come up with a writing system, no problem. All the kids that were born of the TDO Werikyana speaking marriages, TDO is their first language, Portuguese is their second language, Werikyana, yeah, I understand it pretty well. I could get it back if I needed to, that kind of thing, right? So they speak Werikyana with a distinct TDO accent. They do not pronounce things like their elders. And that has given us issues because they don't pronounce all the distinctions that matter for telling words apart. And so we've been trying to decide, do we want our writing system to reflect the majority of speakers, which the clear majority sound like TDO speaking Werikyana, or do we want it to sound like the elders? Well, now suddenly there's a group of like 60 people that was that original 8 coming back from Hishkariana territory. They all sound like the elders, including like a teenager. There's this teenage kid, this guy right here with the pen in his hand. He's like 19 and he sounds just like the elders. Like, okay, now the next job, I say this sounds like the elders. That's me. I'm not even a speaker, right? For the purposes of my writing system, he sounds just like the elders. The next thing is we got to document this and say, maybe they've been influenced to sound more like Hishkariana and Waiwai, which are much more closely related. That'd be like someone, saying I speak English with a Russian accent if I was raised by Russian parents. And, whereas if I were raised by someone, Dutch, which is so much closer to English, then it might work. We need to find out. Maybe their pronunciation has also been altered, but we won't know until we do a documentation and get a really fine-grained analysis. And of course, the people who are doing those transcriptions, we've planned to have a team of Werikyana researchers who will actually get salaries for 3 years to transcribe texts and notice stuff like this. It'd be like, so what do you notice? And then I'll try to confirm it with instrumental studies of phonetics. But if you did an instrumental study, it would take the rest of my next lifetime and this lifetime just to get through half of the text, much less to see if I could find anything. You got to go with the people that know and then just try to test their claims against something that can be measured independently of their perceptions. But I'm sure they're different. I think, just like I was sure I could reconstruct Ideophones. That's why it's science. That's the science part. The humanities part is where all the wind in the sails, the emotional part, the passion comes from that. But the being wrong, that's the science part. Yeah.
So it seems like there's a bit of a difference, but I don't know, just because I'm not familiar with the language. But when he was like the speaker that you showed us singing sound effects, a lot of them were like whispered or subdued. And when you were showing them to us, there was more like emotions you would see in like American politics or something. How is that? Is that common in their languages? Is a lot of the sound effects, Ideophones, is it more based on knowledge and context in the background versus how they sound in the story themselves?
Well, first, my pronunciation was partly driven by wanting everyone to hear him because he was whispering. But second, that's how they are in the other Cariban languages I've worked on. It's this sound effect sentence, sound effect sentence. So they stand out, and most story or most literature on Ideophones, the technical literature, says they are distinguished in some way by intonation, meaning they stand out. He's breaking all the rules. He's also breaking all the rules, and it's not just color commentary. He's telling the story with Ideophones. So that's the long answer. The short answer is I don't know. I'm looking forward to seeing how other storytellers use them. I'm guessing not every storyteller gets real quiet and deep and then gets loud and dramatic. Some storytellers just roll along like this and tell their story, and that's all there is to it. I think he's one of those great storytellers. In addition to everything else, he uses his voice as an instrument. And I don't think all storytellers do in this culture. I will know more, I would hope, 3 years from now. Yeah.
Related question.
Yeah.
Is, does idiophone density or frequency of usage vary as per audience being addressed? In other words, the same story is told 5 times to 5 different audiences of varying size or composition. does the idiophone usage increase or alter or decrease as to the different audience being addressed?
It's untested. I like the idea. I think it's a good hypothesis that there would be a difference. What you're describing is the reason that I am never present during a recording. Because I am trying to learn a little bit. And I discovered early on that if I'm actually in the room, they talk baby talk, basically. They talk foreigner talk.
Yeah.
They don't use their full repertoire, and they actually use wrong grammar because they know that I understand verb roots. And so they'll just say verb roots. Right? So I actually leave the room because I know that when I'm in the audience, if they are showing solidarity with me, they want to make it so I can understand it, which means it's not what I want to record. It's the opposite of what I want to record. So I think it would be fascinating to see if we could do that. It would have to be a natural experiment. I think if you set that up, there'd be no, say, it's hard for me to imagine somebody having to tell the story 5 times in a short period of time where you're recording all of them. That in itself would alter the telling. But I'll bet we could get that natural experiment if we can get a longitudinal, like we're hoping this study will go on for 3 years. We're going to have 40 different people out there with cell phones and microphones recording stuff. If it could happen that you could catch the same person telling the same story 3 different years, and you have a record of who was in the audience, it'd be interesting to see, you know, because I'll bet it makes a difference. If you know there's a couple of old ones that know all those words and you want to impress them, I bet you're going to pull out all the stops. And it is interesting, this story here, I mean, they recorded for 8 hours. This is side 4A. So it's 3 to 3.5 hours. You know, they completed 3 hours. So the guy just said, that's the half you have to do. And I had no idea why. I start wondering, you know, maybe that's when he finally relaxed, because this was not a natural setting for storytelling, right? Sitting at a table, you know, in a block house with screens on the windows, and we had to close the shutters because all the kids were coming in. Ooh, what's he doing? What's going on in there? And it's like, yeah, we're recording quick. So it was a weird setting. And I can imagine it took the guy 3 hours to loosen up and really start getting into it. And that's an important, Bill Labov, a social linguist, has talked about the importance of what he calls the audience's effect in coercing the vernacular, the most natural, or like if you've got a bunch of people you talk to all the time, that's what you're going to use. You're going to use the language with them that you use all the time. Whereas if there's one weird person in the mix, things are, do you play to the person who doesn't belong to your group? And generally what happens, he claims, is that the preponderance, the critical mass of the people that you always talk to, they're going to say, you're talking weird. So you just talk to them the way you always talk. And I'm guessing a lot. I may never know, but if I play my cards right before I die, there will be someone from this group studying linguistics at a university level somewhere. And maybe they will be interested in that question too, and we'll learn something about it. But this is where you need native speakers to become the scholars. That was the one talk about, oh God, now I'm seeing his face and I can't get his name. The famous philosopher from the 60s who died after going to San Francisco. Anyway, at that particular talk, the issue did come up of how to deal with education. You know, how much are you shaping people's minds versus just offering them tools? And how much do you require someone to adopt a particular cultural worldview before they can use the tools that you have available? And that's one of the things I'm concerned about with training people in linguistics. I did train this Wanakawaya woman, Desiree, all the way to a PhD, and near the end, she just looked at me and she said, you do understand this is all bullshit. I'm like, excuse me? And she said, look, I'll play the game, but you're taking my language, my real living, breathing language, and you're killing it, putting it in black marks on the page, cutting it up, putting it into boxes, and you think that's the language. It's like, it's related to the language. It's a window on the language. Yeah. So I'm hoping that anyone I work with will have her internal compass in future work. Unfortunately, I didn't get to keep working with her after she got her doctorate because within a year of going back to Guyana, she was elected to the parliament. Then she was named Minister of Education. And then we only had time for like 2 phone calls a year. And then she had a fatal car accident. And it was like, so this is my dream is to get someone from this group. There are several candidates. There are these brilliant people out there who simply don't have access to Western education right now. And they would have to sacrifice a lot to get it. Neji, for example, the woman who's standing in that picture holding the baby, she's got her degree. She was third when there were only 2 openings. She was third in the concurso, the competition for admission to the master's program. And so she didn't go into the master's program. She went back out to the jungle, and I was talking to her the other day. So do you think about going back? She's like, no, I'm really happy out here. But happiness is no. So, yeah. So anyway, I'm waiting for someone who will both love being out there, love being in the traditional world, and also be willing to take enough time away from that love to become an academic. Both and, not either or. And that's my fear, is that education tends to insist on replacing the worldview, the traditional worldview, with the Western educated worldview. And I would like to find a way to work with people that don't have that vision of it's one or the other, but that says we can do it all. And I can dream.
Any other questions? You mentioned the Summer Institute of Linguistics.
Yeah.
Also creating written language.
Yes.
How much agreement or disagreement is there with them and the group that you're working with? And are there interesting politics going on?
There are interesting politics. The first short answer to your question, there are no differences because the missionaries came to our first workshop, and many of the people who are here actually belong to the missionary group. So the man in the yellow shirt with the glasses looking down at the elder there, he is a pastor in the church. And he's willing to hold both systems in his head simultaneously, which I really appreciate. One of my great sadnesses is that João Duvalle, the guy who brought Churuata to work with me, he's become a pastor, and he's decided that there's only one way, and he's not willing to work anymore with this traditional stuff. So we've lost that intellect for the common cause. The particular NGO that I work with, non-governmental organization, they are violently opposed to missionary work in all of its forms. And so while I don't have violence in my opposition, I like to say I'm always happy to provide a secular alternative, and I'm not happy to contribute to the missionary work. But I'm not out there trying to sabotage missionary work. I think that I'd rather do something different. And the group I work with is willing to accept me conditionally on those terms, even though I don't actually attack the missionary work like they do. But what that means is we do have weird politics every time these things happen. The very first meeting was called by this non-governmental organization, and they were horrified that the missionaries attended. And the third meeting was held in one of the villages where the missionaries live, and they attended again. And there were all kinds of tensions crackling through the air the whole time because they were wishing the missionaries would just go away. And I talked to the missionaries. I actually stayed in the missionary house. They said, you guys can speak English together, because he originally was raised biculturally, both Brazil and American parents. Well, one parent American, one Brazilian. And so, I am in communication with the missionaries, and we're doing our best not to. There are certainly many groups in Latin America where they are 3, 4, 5 writing systems in competition, each championed by a particular community, which has worked with some outsider that insisted this is the right way. And always when you have that situation, one or more of them are brought by missionary activity. And it is an unfortunate reality that very few of the folks whose primary goal is to translate the Bible and create plant the flag of the church in these kinds of settings, very few of them have the time also to study deeply in the linguistic issues involved in coming up with a good writing system. And so often in that competition for writing system,
you can look and in very short order see which one it ought to be, but it's not your call as a linguist. And that's a problem. Fortunately, here we don't have that problem, because right at the beginning, the missionaries were there and they made the changes, and actually I made the changes that the people were calling for me to make. But at least I was able to frame it in, these are the sounds that need symbols. Now you guys figure out how you're going to write them. And that was, the missionaries participated, and we came out with a unified writing system, which I think will be to everyone's benefit. And I feel bad, the Akawayo, that didn't happen. And the missionary writing system is so bad that we had one of the things I do when I'm working in a village somewhere is I'll say, hey, anyone who wants to talk words, come on down. I will show you 5 words or words from 5 different languages for any words you give me in your language. And so we started doing that with Akawayo, and we're having fun, these related languages. And you know, they were telling me how to spell the word in the missionary way, and I was showing them how to spell them in the way that my student Desiree had come up with. And then I said, well, how do you say this word, for instance? And I wrote it on the board in Desiree's, and they said, oh, we don't know. I said, well, come on, you just give me all these others. You read and write. Just tell me how you do it. No, he hasn't taught us that one yet. Turns out it was such a bad writing system that no one's been able to figure it out. And so they just wait, and the missionary actually teaches them sets of words every time they get together for writing systems. And they have spelling bees to compete to see who can remember how to spell. The spelling is so disconnected from the speech that no one had figured it out as of, that was 2004. So that's a situation that I really do not want to see any group get into. And that would be one, if I had continued to work there, I would have probably gotten into a fight. I'd say that one's worth fighting for, because everybody was able to read and write in Desiree's system within about a half an hour, you know, and these people have been working with this guy for years, and they needed him to tell them how to spell a new word. And that's a problem. Oh.
Any other questions for Spike?
This story that you're translating, is that going to be in your book? Or it sounds like an interesting story. Is it an origin story?
It's a part of a much larger origin story. But it's a part that they actually have a name for. They call it Amuye Mahtao. So it's the Paku fish woman. And the proposal that I'm going to create the translation, the original and the translation, and time linked to this recording so that they can have audiobooks, as it were. And this will be for them. Then I'm going to ask permission, say, can I publish this somewhere? And it could come out as just a story. There are various venues for publishing stories. But ultimately the primary reason for translating it is so that they would have it available. And that's really, but the secondary reason is I need people to see how cool this is. Yeah. But that's a selfish reason that doesn't in itself justify the work. And so I'm hoping they will agree. And I think they will. They're pretty proud of their culture. Yeah. As every time I've asked for permission, like I said, you know, can I share some of this? Can I share photos and some of this recording with October? Because he wants to write about it. And they're like, yeah, you can do that. I said, can he do a comic? Yeah, more people will know will know what we're about. And it's like, now they're saying, can he do more? So far, I haven't run into that. The North American cultures have been far more traumatized by their contact with the Western world. And they are much more, reluctant to give that kind of permission to people. You've already destroyed enough. You know, you don't need to ruin this too. The folks I'm working with have not had much of that kind of experience. And they have not been made over generations to feel ashamed for their identity. And so I think my best guess is that unless they become part of a larger political culture that includes, sort of identifying with indigenous folks from both North and South America, that has particular politics that sort of get infused throughout the organization, unless something like that happens, I'm anticipating they're going to want all of this to be public domain. They're being cautious. They're not saying to put this whole recording on the internet, for instance, but they're saying it should happen someday. And let them see the story. Let them see the writing part. I think the actual sound of the man's voice is
they were willing to let me share this, for instance, in this talk. And notice I did two routes. I went to his family members that I'm in touch with and said, do you agree for your grandpa's voice to be out there? And then I went to the village leadership, the chiefs of the different places. It's like, do you agree for this representation of your culture to be out there? And everyone said the same thing. They were all like, we're proud. We are proud of this. Why would we hide it? And I would dearly hope that continues. And if it doesn't, well, it's their call.
So can we get on your email list when you publish it?
I will send something to the Oregon Humanities Center at least. And yeah, I would like to share this story. I gotta say, I've got it all into Portuguese now. Although again, I've got this issue that a part of it is double lines translated. A part of it is done in the other way where there's all the words that aren't in the original, then the sound words. And they both feel so wrong. I still haven't figured out a way to make it feel good. And that's, I think October could help me out with that if he's got a spare year now to do the whole story. That felt right. And they endorsed that. They were thrilled with that 4 panels. It was like, he got it. So I could really see a future in that kind of thing as well. If we just, it's just an awful lot of person power to make those panels, to make those designs. And ideally it should come from within. And I just don't have the skills to offer them any help at all. I could bring materials and say, go for it. And we could get models perhaps that would give them an alternative or a way of thinking about it. But I don't know what they're going to do. And their exposure to literacy is primarily the books that come to the schools, which are all in Portuguese, and all the pictures you expect of grade school books. And so I don't know if they're going to want to imagine that the great literature of our people will be represented as grade school reading primers. I don't know. A graphic novel, they might, that's got a little more heft, maybe. I don't know where it's going to go, but I am excited because this is a completely new turn in my academic work. I'm not doing all the technical linguistics that I was. I can't help myself, but I've actually gotten a long ways away from the speakers in my work in the last 20 years. And I am thrilled to be getting back to the speakers and really plugging in. And now that there's the internet, I don't even have to have 36-hour, plane trips to get into the neighborhood, followed by days on boats. Now I can just say, okay, click. What, they haven't logged on yet? And they're going Starlink in June, which apparently will change. Their current upload speed is slow. Like half the days, it's pixelated pictures, and I don't always get beautiful pictures of them like I shared here. Sometimes they're barely recognizable as people. And I do a screen share to say, oh, look, here's what I did with this thing that we were doing. And they're like, yeah, I can't read it. What, do I need to make it bigger? No, you need to do it tomorrow. A little bit of cloud cover, the internet doesn't work. So let's see, Starlink is supposed to be, 20 times faster and hopefully more robust. We'll find out.
So join me in thanking.
Yeah. Okay. And let me turn this off.